Oops, apologies there, everyone. My internet had a bit of a fizz, but I hope everyone here is well. Nice to see you all again. Excited to do another brainstorming session with other people in the room here. I can see Marguerite is here again. Hello, Marguerite. I'll send you a an invite uh, using our wonderful and erratic guest star. So let's do that right now. Beautiful. And while we're waiting for you to join us, hello everybody else. Um, Lovely once again to hang out with you this Monday afternoon to do a little bit of a brainstorm into creative storytelling. Here at Story City, we work with creators who live in their cities and want to build careers in their cities. And we have a platform that allows anyone to make and tell stories that only open in the right location. So think like Pokemon Go, but for film or audio or books or theatre. So um, Story City has a set of no-code creator tools that are free for anybody to use. And I am one of the editors here at Story City. And every Monday I come on Twitch to brainstorm stories with people. Um, and uh, and we do this every week. So thank you for those of you who have joined us today. And our first guest will be heading in shortly. I can see that Marguerite has her stuff getting ready to go right now. So, hi Marguerite. Let's have a look here. We can't see your image yet, but I'll push you to the stream anyway. Let's see if we can hear you. How are you? Okay. We can't hear or see you quite yet, Marguerite, so you may want to go out and come back in again. But until Marguerite joins us, if there is nobody else here who wants to request to come on stage, as always, I always have projects on the go that we can kind of share with people. So let me share my screen and let's let's work on an adventure together. All right. So I have a choose your adventure that I always plan to work on every week, and then I get distracted by brainstorming other people's stories. I mean, that's why we're here. That's exciting. But essentially, it's a alien invasion story. It's meant to be a comedy. Aliens have come. They're trying to take your beloved piece of public artwork in the center of the city, um, and you are essentially attempting to uh, not only save this piece of public artwork, but to foil an invasion. It was written originally for Adelaide, um, but now I'm adapting it so that it could be placed in any city. And so that's what I am going to be doing right now. So in here, we have a couple of different pathways that we follow. Um, there are going to be 8 different endings. There's kind of like 8 different kind of endings, which then all funnel back into like a single ending, which you can kind of see down here. And then we have a start location in the main mall. So um, the idea is that it's a very bustling place, lots of buskers and those kind of things in the area. Um, and then from there, we are going to be heading down into the center of a city. But we do have the lovely Marguerite here joining us today. How are you doing, Marguerite?
Pretty good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Good, thank you. I thought I'd spend a quick 10 minutes kind of talking to people about how I'm planning to adapt this story, and then maybe we can dive into some questions that you have. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sure.
Awesome. I may as well have you in here
You
anyway.
rushed to get to the logout terminal,
Yeah,
but
for
it's
sure.
clearly
Um, but yeah, so this story never had any images. So eventually, I'm going to have to make images to go with the story. I will probably work with artists that I find on a freelancing website, whether that's DeviantArt or whether that's Upwork or Fiverr or whichever. Um, I do have a lot of like photographs of these locations as well that I could probably adapt to as just an initial port of call, but the idea is that the this initial scene is essentially like setting the scene for the story. Um, and
Yeah,
so you've heard, so you've got some, very jovial atmosphere. So the mall is bustling because Rundle Mall is specifically Adelaide, so we'll have to change that out so it's a bit more generic. Buskers are in full force. Um, there is a flute player on a bike in Adelaide. In Edmonton, there is a man who goes around on roller skates playing guitar with no shirt on. I feel like they're probably too specific references um, to have in any kind of city, so I might remove the very specific reference. Although,
hmm.
um, there generally are, like when you're talking buskers, like balloon men creating things. Um, and I've already used busker, so street magician appears to have held onto a good 30% of her crowd. Everyday citizens, because we want to have this in any city, so it won't just be Adelaideans. Everyday citizens are going about their business, shopping for drinks, jovial atmosphere. About to go into the local bookstore. That's what Dimmicks is, although it is more of a chain store in Australia. Suddenly, a dark shadow passes over the sun, and the mall's balls is the public artwork that this story refers to. Um, um, so that might not be the best thing to reference here. That would be something that I would remove. Suddenly, a dark shadow passes over the sun. I could probably just remove that in general. Something is different. There are noises. So in this end, we're kind of referencing one end of the mall. So the idea is that you're meant to kind of disseminate your way through downtown. Um, um, and you're essentially heading into the main center for downtown. So I think the end of a mall is probably generic enough, but we might run into trouble when we start placing locations. Um,
So it seems like you could adapt this, like if you wanted to
mm,
do like, say for Calgary, there's Chinook Mall, or there's Eau Claire Market downtown, or there's the core, like West Edmonton Mall would be an example in Edmonton, like
mm.
making it specific to that, like I think we were talking about.
Yeah, I have a question for you. So
Mhm.
in Australia, most malls are not indoor malls. A lot of malls are open air, um, central shopping districts, right? So they're open air. It's a pedestrian kind of
Mhm.
street, right? So no cars go down it, but there's shops on either side, and it's a main
Right.
kind of shopping district. Do you call those malls in North America?
Uh, yes, kind of. Our malls are more like, West Edmonton Mall.
Yeah, which is indoors. or Chinook, which is also an indoor mall.
Yeah, so that's more common. We do have sort of like Stevens Avenue,
Mm-hmm.
where you've got stores on each side, like both sides, and then there's a structure, like a office building kind of structure.
So,
I
so what
think
would
that
you
a
what would you
definite probably
call
has something to
yeah, what would you call those kind of areas then?
uh, walkways. I mean, I don't know if there's a specific word for it that I know of.
Hmm. The maybe pedestrian, maybe like the pedestrian street,
Yeah.
like or the pedestrian zone. The
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
central shopping district.
I mean, there's a boardwalk.
Yeah, maybe the central shopping district is bustling. Buskers are out in full force.
Yeah.
Everybody's citizens going about their business, shopping and meeting for drinks. So then you could kind of keep it generic to
Mm.
the follow it to the
Street market.
follow it to the main street. Um, follow it to the maybe intersection. So you look down the main street in shock. There's a giant spaceship hovering over the city square. You could pick any city square in that case. There's one outside Town Hall in Edmonton. In Calgary, there are quite a few, you know, park squares that you could probably use. There's definitely quite a few in Vancouver. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, we can still reference ACDC. That's fine. Um, the monument statue. Place is um, littered with hippies, or maybe hipsters is the better phrase. Now, so every year Adelaide has a fringe. Every year Edmonton has a fringe. There is normally a fringe mascot most years. Obviously, not every city is going to have a fringe or some form of mascot, right? So you would need something that is that the rainbow lasers vaporize, essentially.
Ah, that's an interesting question. I couldn't really say like I don't for the fringe. I know Calgary has one too, but I don't know about a mascot. I've never actually been to a fringe. Like I've heard of it obviously, but
Hmm. I think what I might do is I might have that one of the rainbow lasers vaporizes a passing bus. There are always buses of some description
yeah.
going around a city generally. Unless you're in, even if you're in San Francisco, there are still buses, even with those cable cars. So,
Yeah.
um, you pick up your mobile is an Australian term, so we're going to go for cell phone. Um, do you normally have city halls or town halls in North America?
Both.
Yeah, doesn't
Yeah,
really
it
matter.
depends where you are.
If you were in
Yeah.
Calgary and you said the town hall, would you go to the city hall if there was
Mm.
not a town hall?
I mean, in Calgary, it is City Hall. That's like the government
Mm.
office. For if you're talking about what's the purpose for it? Like, what's the.
So it's essentially a location where you were going to the government for help. You're like, oh, we're being invaded. What does the government want us to do about
Yeah,
this? Right.
you'd go to City Hall.
So you go to City Hall. Okay. So I
I
suppose I
mean,
wonder if that depends on the size of the city.
but then again, if something bad's happening, wouldn't you call 911?
Well, yes. So that's also another option that ends up happening in this scenario, right? Um, so you're essentially you're trying to use your cell phone, but the phone's just emitting white noise, so you can't call 911, right?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So you're essentially
So
trying to
yeah, I'd go to.
call. So you're essentially trying to call your friend in City Hall. So you're trying to see, like, is this, you know, you're still not quite certain that you're not hallucinating. So you just wanted to check with someone, right?
Yeah. Hmm.
Um, but because you can't get a hold of anyone, you're like, oh, okay, no, this is definitely odd. So clearly something's going
Hmm.
on. You decide you need to contact authorities, which ones you
Hmm.
don't know. Um, do does some version of the MIB exist in this country?
Um, you MIB meaning Men in Black?
Correcto.
Yeah.
Mm.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about Calgary, then and this seems to me like something you'd be experiencing on Stevens Avenue,
Mm.
which is like that walk, like there's the cobblestone, it's the walkway, like it's a street market kind of, not a street market, but like you're walking down the middle, and then all the shops and restaurants are on both sides.
Yeah.
And then right down, like if you look straight down Stevens Avenue, City Hall is right there.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
this kind of seems perfect for that space.
and that's how most downtowns are structured, right? And so that's essentially what we're going for. So like if you were doing it in, I don't know, New York, for example, there are a bunch of central places like
Mhm.
Times Square and the new square around the Freedom Towers, and like there exists a
Mhm.
bunch of different kind of like areas that you have the same thing. You've got like this main shopping district that goes into into some sort of downtown. Um, um, Now, the one problem that we may run into is that a lot of cities have actually started ripping out their payphones, right? So
Yeah.
I actually went and checked this on Google Street View. So if you go to the Google Street View and you go to Adelaide,
Mhm.
um, and you drop a little person in the main street
Mhm.
using Street View,
Yeah.
you can see that they still have payphones in the main street.
Mhm.
So, let's have a look here.
I know some of the hotels still have payphones, like the older ones still have
Yeah,
payphones.
because, yeah, so see right there. So this guy still exists and it actually acts as a Wi Fi point in the city, right?
Wow.
Um, but so this was there many, many moons ago when I originally wrote this story, and now it still exists on both sides of the road. So you either down one side of the road, you end up calling one person, down the other side of the road, you end up calling another. But I think that would be the only major issue, is if you had a series of payphones that were close enough together. Um,
Yeah.
and so I don't know. I think for the moment, I would probably leave it in and just see if I couldn't find some payphones in the new
Hmm.
cities that I went into. But if it was getting too hard to find them, I'd probably have to think of something else. So you would either have to, because on one side, in the payphone, you get a call from the leader of the country, the Prime Minister of Australia in the original story. Or you get a call from the local, like someone calls the payphone and it turns out to be a journalist from the local newspaper, right?
Yeah.
So, um,
Could you, I mean,
hmm.
that's a story. I'm wondering, like, could you not just say there's a payphone even if there isn't one?
So, um, generally with accessories you could, right? Like, so if you went into a cafe and you said the cafe was full of cats, or you went into a store and you were like, it's full of plants, right? Those kind of accessories, or like there's a table here, et cetera, like what we talked about last week, where accessories are things that you could very easily imagine. So that's fine. Whereas a payphone is a piece of physical infrastructure, and if it wasn't there, then you would run into believability issues, right? Where like I understand that this is like we've just introduced like a spaceship that's got like a rainbow laser techno rave going on. Um, but like
Hmm.
the idea is it's meant to you're meant to ground people in physical reality so that
Hmm.
like you can do that. I mean, you could go completely
Yeah.
ridiculous because this is meant to be a ridiculous comedy, right? And so you could
Hmm.
go completely ridiculous and like get smart at, where you know how in Get Smart, how they used to be agents that used to hide in trees and then they'd pop open like their little like the tree knot or whatever, and you would exchange information, and then they wouldn't want to let you go because they're really bored in their tree and so they want to have a conversation with you. So you could do
Yeah.
that. You could get
Hmm.
pretty like so you could get pretty Get Smart meta on that if
Right.
you wanted.
Uh-huh.
Um, but I don't know. I don't know. Maybe it's a case of, because you've knocked the cell service out, so like maybe it's a case of
Right.
you are sending people to a cool shop, that has been abandoned because the owner
Hmm.
has freaked out and run away, and so you use the landline, right? So like you could probably get away with that actually, where you could just pick some
Hmm.
fun looking stores in the neighborhood that you could walk into to see if they have a landline, and only to see that all of the shop assistants have run away because they freaked out, and then the phone rings and you answer it. um, so that could be a way to get around to the payphone problem if you had.
One other thought I had actually, this would be a really, I don't know if there's maker spaces in Edmonton. I think there's probably one or two. I know there's a few in Calgary where they actually build stuff like this.
Mm.
And it might be a fun sort of collaboration if you wanted to go that far and say, hey, could you design us an actual, phone booth?
Yeah, yeah. Where it ends up being a physical installation. Yeah. I think like I do
Mhm.
enjoy the idea of those kind of things, particularly when you mix them with like festivals, and those kind of things. What I think that I'm trying to do with this story in particular is just make it as generic as possible so I can literally pick it up and drop it anywhere. Um,
Right.
mainly in Canada and the US at this point. Um, but the other part that would, be problematic is obviously you can't necessarily give very specific directions, so you've got to send them somewhere. Um,
Mhm.
and I think that, the key in this case, like because you don't know whether there's a set of pedestrian lights there, you don't know what direction the central square is, right? Is it west? Is it east? Is it north? Is it south of where you're Sandy are going to be setting it up. So what I think would probably um, um, work here um, is either you tell someone to go to the east or the west side of the road, or you tell someone to go to the north or the south side of the road, right? Searching for a landline. I think that that's going to be your best bet, where you have one version that has an east and a west, and one version that has a north and a south. So, for example, Stephen Avenue, all of the shops are lined north-south, right? In Adelaide, all of the shops would be down the main street towards the square would be lined on the east or the west. So do you head to the west side of the road to search for a landline that you can call your friend, or do you run down the west side of the road? And so you make the one that is more easily accessible harder. So if the west side of the road happens to be the side of the road that you're on, right, you would be like, oh, do you go down the west side of the road? You don't have to cross the street, but there's more people on the sidewalk, or do you go to the east side of the road where there's less people and search for a phone, right? And so you could introduce the uncertainty that way,
Right.
Which I think is probably the best way to do it. And I'd probably call this the invasion east-west, so that, and then I would have another version of the story which I would create that would have invasion north-south.
So then it would be, my when I heard east, west, north, south, the first thing I thought was, what about is it going to make a difference if it's, say, southeast or southwest or northeast or northwest, that kind of thing?
Well, so most cities tend to be tend to be north south or east west, right? Tend being the key word there. But if you look at like Manhattan, for example, you do have the you have Broadway cutting a diagonal across the city, right? So if you wanted to be on Broadway leading to one of the city centers, then that's not going to work, right? So, and in Vancouver, the main Vancouver downtown is on kind of like an island that is more northwesterly in its orientation, and so everything on there is a grid in that kind of orientation. So yeah, it's going to depend on what you do with that.
Like, would you be making another, like, because it seems like it being so directionally driven.
Because essentially you just want to split them. Because essentially you just want to split them off, right? So you kind of want to split them in different directions so that you can fan out. And so that means that there's more variety in the terms of locations that you can select. There's more variety in terms of the places that they can go see, etc. Right?
Right.
So yeah, so that's an interesting question, because like the cities that I'm thinking of, all of our streets are kind of north, south, east, west. But obviously you cannot guarantee that.
Yeah, I know. I find just even looking at that, like I think it was you showed Adelaide there at one point, like you were showing street level. And it struck me how it's on the other side of the world, and the pattern of the street is basically the same as here.
Yeah.
Like I think every major city in the world, at least in the Commonwealth, has pretty much the same structure.
even if we look at like, because Edmonton's very quite north-south in its orientations.
Yeah.
Even if we look at major
I mean, there
cities
is,
in Canada, like these are not like it's almost straight enough to be considered northwest, like north anyway. So like it's yes, it is on a slight lean, but it's still basically when people they would be saying like north up, Youngest and south down it, and east or west, right? Like east or west side of the street, even though they might be going northeast or northwest. Um, let's look at Montreal, because Montreal's a lot more hilly than other cities. So this one is definitely at a slant, right? It's obviously gridded,
yeah.
um, but it's definitely not north and east as a um, orientation. All right, back to the drawing board then on that one. How do you get people to split up so that you can essentially split them down to different areas? Um, hmm. I suppose I'll have to have a think on that one and come back with a solution next week.
Well, it's when you're, I find it really interesting. Like, and one thing I was wondering about, say, like cities like Vancouver, or let's say you wanted to go to Nelson or San Francisco, places like that, where it's like even the main streets are like on this huge incline because the mountains are so steep. Does that impact the navigation, or like I don't know if that would make a difference to when you're trying to go to restaurants?
it depends, right? Generally, navigation is harder in cities because tall skyscrapers will block satellite signal, and so they'll
Hmm.
place you in weird spots on a street, or they'll place you a street away, or those kind of things because the satellite signal's not bouncing correctly.
Right.
You can then also get that problem though, where if you have a really hilly area, if you're in the valley between two hills, then that could also play havoc with GPS systems as well. It gets easier and easier and easier in large cities because as we become more and more Wi-Fi connected, Google Maps uses the Wi-Fi as a extra point to help you
Right.
geolocate. Um, so it uses that signal to help you do that. Um, so it's becoming less and less of an issue, but it does still happen. Um,
Yeah.
and I suppose here, like, because essentially what I'm wanting is for you to be able to make a phone call, right?
Hmm.
And because you have two separate phone calls at these two locations. And the thing about generic locations, to build generic locations for a location based story, um, it helps if you can be like, go to a tree, go to a bench, go to a payphone, right? And so if we are taking into account the fact that, okay, payphones may not exist in some cities anymore, what is the next idea? So your cell phone isn't working. So how do you get access to a telephone? And so what are generic locations where you would be almost guaranteed to have access to telephone lines because they were protected for
Hmm.
emergency purposes? And so maybe the way that we do that is by being like, okay, so down one street you head to a local store because surely a landline at that local store is going to work, right? Or maybe you head to a bank because banks have like panic buttons and all those kind of things. So that sort of infrastructure has to be hardwired in and is generally protected. So maybe um, yeah. So maybe that's it. Yeah. I think that might have to be the alternative, right? Where like in one scenario you have access to payphones, um, which would make this go easier, uh, following the original story. And
Yeah.
then you have a version where you send them to a bank or they just pick a random store that they go into.
So I had a thought, and I don't know, because alien invasion, where a lot of, and I don't know how many cities have these, but in Calgary, the C train lines, like the rapid transit lines,
Mm-hmm.
have emergency phones in the cars.
Yeah, yeah.
But I don't
They
know
they tend
how.
to have emergency phones at the stations, just in general.
Yeah.
Um, so um, yeah, so that might be a good one if you had some sort of train transit system or a tram transit system that um, on a platform you have access to that. Um, yeah, we'd probably just have to bring up a couple of random um, cities and check, right? We'd have to bring up a couple of random cities and be like, okay, here's a bunch of major cities in Canada. Here are their town squares. Here are their shopping streets. Um, in this area, what is there? There's banks. There's shops. There's where are the main transit lines? Are there emergency phones there? Like, because you wouldn't be able to necessarily get have them jump on a train, um, particularly if they're a subway, like an underground, because they've paid for the adventure. You don't necessarily then want them to also be paying for public transport if you can help it, because that just reduces the number of people who will pick an option, right?
Mhm.
So it skews the story. Um, it adds a bias into the story for the choices. Um,
Right.
mm. But if the emergency phone was accessible outside of pay areas, then yeah, that is a very smart idea. And sometimes those shopping streets will actually have emergency phones in the street as well. So depending. Hmm. Okay. Awesome. Well, um, that was a fun exercise for the first chapter at the very
Yeah.
least. But you also came here for a question to brainstorm as well this week.
Well,
So what are we
it's
brainstorming with you today?
it ties in pretty well to that story, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, what's the most effective way of linking? Because one of the things I'm looking at is integrating businesses into the storyline.
Mm-hmm.
So, say for example, I don't know. I guess we could use the payphone, really,
Mm.
but let's pretend it's not a payphone; it's an actual phone. You're gonna sell that on the like my. What I was wondering about is like integrating because a picture or a video or a link or something like that into the mix. So I'm presenting that content inside of that storyline. And I was just wondering from a visual standpoint, like what's most effective. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, when you're integrating businesses, um, there's a couple of different things you can do, right? Like we obviously talked in previous weeks about you adding in links to like your shop or their
Mhm.
shops or those kind of things. But because you are already telling an interactive kind of romance love story, right? One of the best ways to really showcase a local business is by essentially doing like their origin story, right? So them being like, hi, we're Marge and Bob, and we started this store 35 years ago.
Yeah.
And so, why did we start this store? Because we have a great love for hand making things things because we wanted to drink ourselves silly with our own beer, like, like whatever that story might be, right? Why did they set it up there? What do they love about their
Yeah.
town or their city? And so what you can do, and it depends on how overt you want to be about it, right? Like, so do you want to be um um do you want to be um having a video, a short, like 1 minute video of them introducing themselves as the feature video for that location? Or
Right.
is the feature imagery for that location um, the the character or the artwork for that
Mhm.
character handling that, soap or whatever that might be, um, and or drinking a coffee at said coffee shop or whatever that might be,
Yeah.
and then in the story itself, you essentially having pop-ups or videos embedded in the
Yeah.
page, right? And so you would have um, and so you might have something in the story where you're like, you remembered seeing a video of them talking about how they started on social media, and that's why you came in one Sunday morning, and now you keep coming back for their hot chocolates, right? Or
Yeah.
their coffee, or whatever that is, right? And so you could then embed that video on the main page, or like, so in the Story City creator tools, you could actually create pop-ups. So they leave like little Easter eggs where if you tap on them, it brings up this little pop-up window that gives you an audio or a video or images or text,
Right.
right? Where you can let people know about. You could show people that video interview with the handmade artists whose work they sell or whatever that might be, right?
Yeah.
So there's those ways that you can kind of do that um, too. And so if we were to take the alien invasion story, where you're like, okay, can't use my mobile phone, so I have to go into two different areas. And so your two clients that you are um, supporting in a town, one is a shoe shop, and then the other one is a bank, right? Because um, particularly local like credit unions and things like that tend to um, want to promote in weird and wonderful ways. And so then you could list a generic shop, right? And so in that shop, um, the proprietors have left. Oh, you remember being in here previously because you drank coffee or you bought some
Right.
soap here, or like whatever it is that you've built into the narrative there, and then they get their phone call and so then that way you're like, oh yeah, I got soap here, and then you would have a link to the soap that
Yeah.
they sell, or they could wander around the shop while they're listening to the narration of the story, um and yeah, and like, and do things that way as well, right? So um
Right.
and then you could provide like discounts, so you could have a pop-up modal that allows them to show a discount coupon or whatever, right? Um, so um, that could be ways that you could incorporate it too.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that idea of the pop-up.
Yeah, because it allows you to put additional information without ruining the flow of the story. And then the way that you let people know that it exists, right, is that in the description for the story, you're like, check out the pop ups. They tell you cool things about the local businesses that you visit in this adventure. Um, and every week there'll be new pop ups and new messages or whatever,
Yeah.
right? And so that way, like, even if you were to do like, because we were talking about you doing it in 9 installments, right? And so each
Mhm.
episode would visit however X many number of locations.
Mhm.
You could then um, you could then um, each new week, maybe one week you test, those origin story videos, and you're like, does that drive any purchases? And then the next week you're like, okay, what happens if our pop-up is a discount code? Do people use it? And then the next week you could be like, okay, do you get the owners to record a clue? that then gets put in a video, and then how does that then affect people talking to them by name or whatever, right? So you can like test different like pop-up type content to see what drives the most engagement. Maybe one week you add in a little scavenger hunt, and another week you add in like whatever, right? And so you can use that, particularly when you're doing this the first round and you're testing it in the first town that you're doing it in. And so you can test the metrics of that, right?
Yeah.
What drives more sales or visitations for that business? Um, and is that a result of the content, or is that a result of the additional pop-ups that you included in that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are my thoughts on it.
Well, that's helpful. Yeah. Well, I mean, that was really, yeah, that was the biggest question I have is like, because my thing was like, I went into the system, I thought, okay, how do you like structurally lay this out? Because when I'm talking to businesses, that's one of their biggest questions is how does that actually work? Like what's step by step? And it almost seems worth it to put together a little clip or a video or infomercial, like infographic kind of video to be like, okay, this is the process. This is actually how you put that content inside of an experience like this.
Yeah, exactly. And so like, and you can even like it depends on like how crazy your like Photoshop skills are, right? But like for one story that we did, let me find the artwork for it actually. So we went to a model on Fiverr, and we got her to do a bunch of different photographs of her in a wedding dress in a bunch of different positions. Now, it's weirder than it sounds because the story was about this ghost that you come across, and she is a ghost bride, and she has died, and you're trying to figure out what killed her on her wedding day. And so what we ended up doing was that let me just one moment. So if I share my screen here, we we got this model on Fiverr to put on a wedding dress and be in a bunch of different positions like this. And then we photoshopped her into photographs that we took of the location. Um, and then we um, uh, like put the photographs through like a sepia filter, so or like a black and white filter, and we put a little vignette around the outside. And so we took like location shots. Um, we gave them a bit of a black and white treatment, and then we overlaid her poses over in Photoshop, right? And so like if you had a skill set, like a Photoshop skill set, you could have a whole bunch of these scenes that you have planned out. You know how that character is going to be like, leaning on a counter speaking to the shopkeeper or whatever that might be. And so you go into that shop once a week and you take photographs that are relevant to how you've positioned a model. And you just take a bunch of photographs of the model and then you like Photoshop that person in. So like you can also like go that deep into it as well, right? Um, but then um, uh, obviously, as you start to scale, um, that's kind of possible because you've gone to each new city and you've done the experience, and you've gotten on board very specific partners in that city, so that might actually be manageable. Whereas if we did that version where, as we were talking about, like you're wanting to build a global audience, and so you're wanting that global audience that as soon as that episode's out, they can place that in their city, right? And you're using global brands like, if we're talking banks like, RBC um uh Rogers as the phone carrier and blah 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 blah. So like if you're using like national brands, and so that doesn't matter what city that it's in, you've got to pick a Rogers store and a RBC Bank and blah 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 blah. And then you would obviously not be able to go that specific into the visuals of a story, right? Because you wouldn't know which RBC location in a city someone was putting it into. And so you would then have to get much more generic with any visual assets that you had, right?
Yeah, that makes
Beautiful. All right. Well, thank you for coming and brainstorming with me today, Marguerite. It was very delightful to be able to pick the brain
sense.
of a North, like even though I live in Canada, like, and I generally will have an idea of how Canadians or like North Americans like will name things, and like those kind of stuff. It's good to have someone here to be able to check and be like, so
Yeah.
right?
I
So
mean,
to
I'm
be able to
sure.
do those kind of adaptations, and you see like the types of things that come up when you're trying to think of generic locations and how to structure a story generically so it can be placed in as many cities as possible. And right, like it's obviously so much easier to be location specific and to put in a bunch of details about a very specific city, right? But obviously for scalability, for you to be able to build, like revenues and business that grows exponentially, um, those more generic location based stories um, uh, obviously make your ability to do that easier.
Yeah, one thing I've seen these videos of people from, say, Canada, Australia, the States, England, and they all get together and say, "What's this?" And they pull up a picture, and
Mm.
it's five different things. And sometimes even like the language around this kind of stuff is like so different depending on where you are, even if it's the same language.
Mm. I remember when I was traveling, I traveled through South America for a little bit, and we were sitting in a hostel, and there was myself who was an Australian, there was the hostel owner who was a British person, and then
Mhm.
there was what a traveler who was Canadian, and then he was traveling with a woman from Belgium who spoke English, right? So she knew how to speak English quite fluently. But like the three of us were having this big conversation, right? And regardless of accents or like misplaced like words, we shuffled about in our brain and whatever, it was fine. And we get to the end of that 20-minute conversation, and the girl looked at us and she said, I have no idea what you guys were speaking about, because of just that mix of accents, the mix of terminologies, the mix, and like we had enough scope to be able to pick up the general gist of what was going on, but like when you weren't used to that, like it's yeah, and because we had all been traveling as well, we were used to doing that. Whereas I would very frequently meet people who hadn't done anywhere near as much traveling as I had, who would be like, "What does this mean?" Um, like Australians say arvo for afternoon. Should we do that this arvo? And people are like, I don't understand what you're talking about. Or we, rather than saying bi-weekly, we say fortnight. So every two
Yeah.
weeks, right? And so that trips a whole bunch of people up as well. And so it's interesting what will and what won't trip someone up. Um,
Mhm.
and you don't really know until you start traveling or you start talking to people from other places. So it's fun. Well, thanks, Marguerite. It's a pleasure, as always, to brainstorm with you. Thank you for joining me. For those of you who are maybe watching this recorded or watching this on our YouTube channel afterwards, we have a platform called Story City that allows you to put interactive stories in real world locations where people can unlock audio or video or images or text in the right location. The tool is free for creators to use at storycity.app. You can set up an account, you can become a creator, you can also sell your stories as well. We have lots of creator resources. We have these weekly brainstorming sessions every week on Twitch. which then get uploaded into YouTube. And then we also on Fridays and Thursdays have an adventure hour where we live read and argue our way through a choose your own adventure that exists on the platform with its creators. So please do join us for those as well. They're a lot of fun. They're very stupid. We are definitely not professionals, but that's okay. So, professional voice actors, I should say. We are professional storytellers. We are not necessarily professional voice actors. But we have a lot of fun trying. So, thank you, Marguerite, again for joining us this week, and I'll see you next week.
Yeah,